You're listening to the Sea Change podcast, covering the trends and issues in Southeast Asia.
Hello all, and welcome back to another episode of the Sea Change podcast. My name is Nick Basson. Today we're joined by Robert Law from Asialink Business. Rob has an extensive background in both the private and public sector and has been involved in the Australia-Southeast Asia space for an extended period. He's a trusted advisor to the government on policies and programs to support companies' growth in Asia, working seamlessly at the intersection of government and business. To kick off our conversation today, Rob, it'd be fantastic to hear about some of your experiences in the region and how you became involved in the space.
Thanks, Nick, and great to be with you. I've been either studying Southeast Asia or working on Southeast Asia for over 20 years. I first started studying Indonesian at university and fell in love with it. And I was really fortunate that my career as a diplomat took me to Jakarta for 4 years. And then from there back to Australia, where I worked in roles in government focused on Southeast Asia, and then out into the consulting and the corporate world, where, again, I've been really fortunate to continue my focus on the region. I love the diversity of Southeast Asia, and Indonesia is a part of the world that I'm really familiar with and I'm really comfortable with. And in particular, I do like demystifying Indonesia to people who may not be as familiar with it.
So that's really interesting, your background with Indonesia especially. So last year, Indonesia got put on the world map, I'd say. A lot of people, a lot of eyes had attention on Indonesia through the G20. Kind of looking on to that to March this year, how has that momentum translated? Is Indonesia still a focal point of the world, or do you think that subsided, or has that momentum carried in and really helped Indonesia become more established?
Well, the G20 was a really great outcome for Indonesia, really solidified its credentials as a diplomatic actor on the world stage. And coming into 2023, I think the profile and the focus still is on Indonesia quite strongly because of its standing as an emerging market. So from a trade and investment perspective in particular, it's looking like a real bumpy year for the world economy, but there's a number of emerging markets in Asia in particular that look quite attractive, and Indonesia is one of those markets.
I know last year you went to Indonesia and you actually met with the Go-To group during your time in Jakarta. It'd be very interesting to hear some of your perspectives around the Indonesian technology sector. It's always been growing fast. It's set to reach almost 200 billion in total transactions this year. I know living here in Indonesia, a lot of the digital wallets and so on is the mainstay in life. You can't survive without them. What some of your perspectives around the Indonesian tech sector? Should Australian companies be looking at investing there?
Yeah, look, when it comes to the Indonesian tech sector, it's been hit by the same headwinds that have hit the global tech sector, right? So declining valuations, and a lot of challenges that come with that. But I really take a long-term view of the sector. And I think over the next 5 to 10 years, it's poised for quite significant growth. And I had the privilege of meeting quite a few tech companies while I was in Jakarta. And what really stood out to me is that they are starting to focus on challenges outside the digital domain. Of course, you get maybe fintechs, and they have products or offerings that are exclusively in the digital domain. But many of these startups are focused on problems that start to intersect with the real world, challenges around logistics, around supply chain, around health and so on. And I'm quite interested to see over the next few years what contribution they play to the development of Indonesia in those areas and more.
I really liked one of the articles you wrote where you poised this idea of setting up a VC fund, whether it's through the Australian government or from like an Australian initiative into Southeast Asia. How do you think something like that would almost accelerate Australia-Indonesian business relationships, but a model you could pilot in Indonesia and take elsewhere to Southeast Asia?
That's a topic that I've been passionate about for a little while. And I think the attractiveness of it is that VCs work on a 6 to 10, maybe 6 to 12 year time frame in terms of getting their financial return, which to me, in terms of a horizon, sits pretty well with where I think the Indonesian economy is going and where I think the startup sector is going. So I think there is a strong case for greater linkages between the startup ecosystems and the technology ecosystems in Australia and Indonesia. And I want to be really clear that, I see it as a real two-way partnership. There are some things in Indonesia where they are more advanced from a technology perspective than we are in Australia. I mean, if you take GoTo and where that's going as an app, it's integrated mobility, e-commerce and finance. We don't have an equivalent offering in Australia that does all those things. So there's certainly a lot of potential to build trade investment links. And I think it also spills over to people links as well. And one of the things we're also seeing is that, startup founders and people who've worked in startups are increasingly crossing over to the political sphere as well in Southeast Asia. So I think from a government perspective, there's an opportunity to build Australian influence in the region as well by cooperating around the tech sector.
Some really interesting points there. I think one company, Bukalapak, they actually have an office in Melbourne these days as well.
That's right.
I think if we could make more linkages like that, so imagine the number of Indonesian software engineers that are coming over to Australia and things vice versa and so on. I actually have an Australian friend here that works for Bukalapak in the Jakarta office. So I think having those programs, having those channels for people to create and collaborate together is really important going forward. In terms of investment, how do we drive investment into these Southeast Asian markets? If we look at Indonesia, for example, Australia-Indonesia investment relationship has never really reached its potential. It's always been untapped, underdone. What is going wrong in some of these relationships? What do Australian businesses need to improve to access these markets, which have huge potential going forward? Obviously, we don't want to miss the boat, and now's the time to move. We've got that 5, 6, 10-year time horizon. We need to get strategically ready. How should we navigate that?
Yeah, look, I think on investment, you need to bring a real sort of balanced view to it. So, we need to be clear that there are challenges in the region when it comes to investment. There are governance concerns, there are risk concerns, there are a number of things that would give an investor reason to pause and consider very carefully what they're doing. Well, on the flip side, though, many of those concerns can be mitigated, and the opportunity is so big, it's impossible to ignore it. And so it's about how do you make those trade-offs from an investment perspective. I guess when I look at the investment space, particularly from an Australian perspective, when you talk to super funds and other investors, they'll tell you that the deal flow in Australia is slowing. And they're quite used to looking at US and European markets, but those are highly competitive. And, growth is also starting to slow in those markets and returns are lower. So where do you start to look for new opportunities? And emerging markets certainly look attractive. And I think it's a question of not if, but when Australian investment starts to go into Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular. We've seen the Canadian pension funds go in, and they've been in the region for a few years now. But, from my discussions with the super sector, they are at a very early stage in terms of this journey. They're still building their familiarity with the region. They're still understanding the key sectors that they're interested in. And the question really is, how long does that process take? Is it going to be 2 years before we see the first major investment by an Australian super fund in Indonesia? Or is it going to be 8 years? And what can government do to support and accelerate that timeframe?
When we talk about that sector approach, they're still in the phase of discovery. From your point of view, where in Southeast Asia, what markets, what kind of sectors are natural partners for Australia or natural avenues for investment? We've recently talked about the tech sector, but what else is out there for Australian investors that you think we could take our competitive advantage to that market?
Well, I should, be really clear that I'm not an investor. I'll be a little careful about what I say here. But, from a consumer demand perspective, these markets are on a real upwards trajectory. So any sectors that are linked to, sort of growing consumer demand, and also the desire, I guess, of these countries to move up the value chain in a lot of sectors. So you are seeing increasing investment in advanced manufacturing, logistics, transport, and of course it's impossible to ignore the opportunities in renewables and clean energy as well. So there's quite a lot there. I think it really is, when you talk to investors, they tend to look sectorally. They tend to not really think about things from a market perspective. So they will go and look at a particular sector and really dig into where the opportunities are. Now, we know that there is already some investment in the public markets in Southeast Asia. I understand that the Indonesian stock exchange has been attractive for a little while because it's relatively stable and predictable returns in recent years. But the question is, are Australian investors going to branch out into sort of direct investment into infrastructure and to other areas?
An interesting point when we talk about investment. Yes, it's important for Australian investment to happen in the region, but how do we invite investment back to Australia? So I know we've had some previous conversations about tracking the money, Indonesian investment in Australia. So recently I've done a bit of research. The Wijayas, Salim, they have significant holdings in the Australian resource market. How do we encourage more Southeast Asia business to come to Australia, to get the Australians to realise that, hey, this is a market with huge opportunity, but they've also got cash to burn on investments, and they're looking for markets like Australia with stable political systems, with good governance, good systems in place, and they need the money. They're looking to diversify. How can we invite those investors in?
Yeah, I think it's a really great point you make, and I'm glad you've been digging into it because I think there's more Indonesian investment that comes into Australia than, we might otherwise realise, and part of that is because a lot of it comes via Singapore. What is clear is that Indonesian investment into Australia and Southeast Asian investment more broadly creates significant numbers of jobs in Australia. We certainly want to see more. I think there's definitely a bit of two-way education that needs to happen. And, I'll sort of put aside the deal-making part of it, because that's not an area where I'm an expert. But the part I do know a lot about is Asia capabilities. And, I think it's really important that we build the capabilities to understand, each other in the business and in the investment space. And to be really clear, when I talk about Asia capabilities, we mean a whole range of things. It's not just, cultural aspects. It's about, what are the business practices in a particular Asian country? How do you build connections and networks? How do you increase your understanding of the market? How do you increase your understanding of the sector that you're targeted in? So there's a whole range of things that go into making up Asia capability. And I think across the board, we need to lift that in Australia.
I think that's an extremely important point here, because I was having a chat to someone the other day and we were talking about Indonesian investment coming into Australia. And there's interested parties coming in. However, there's always a bit of friction with Australian businesses there. How can I work with this different counterpart? What do I need to understand about their market? So I think being able to build up that capacity for Australian business is really important for inward and outward bound investment. Programs like the Asialink Business and so on that they do with Australian private sector is extremely important in upskilling those members of our business community. Shifting gear a little bit here, we've talked a lot about the private sector. We've got to increase Asian business capability. We've got to look at all these different markets, do our investigation and so on. From an Australian government standpoint, how can we better our approach to the region? I hear people talking that Australia's got some really good expertise. They understand the market the best from all these other countries, from the Japanese, Korean and so on. But it's not changing how we interact on a business level. What can we do differently from a foreign policy standpoint to engage with the region better?
Yeah, look, that's a really interesting question. And I'm glad you mentioned, Japan and Korea, because I think one of the first things we need to do when we think about this challenge is appreciate that it's an incredibly competitive environment that we are playing in. And our competitors, in many cases, are our political friends. Countries like the US, Japan and Korea can be both partners, but also competitors for us in the region. Of course, Chinese companies are in there as well. And Southeast Asian countries do a huge amount of business between themselves. So understanding the competitive space is really important. I am quite interested in the question of how does Australia build influence from an economic perspective? And part of the reason I touched on the super sector earlier is, personally, I think it's probably one of the most potent tools of influence that Australia has in its toolkit when it comes to engaging Southeast Asia. To help put that in perspective, the forecast is that by 2030, Australian super funds will have $6 trillion funds under management. Now, if only 1% of that, so $60 billion, if only 1% of that was invested in Southeast Asia, that is still about 12 or 13 times our entire aid budget. So I don't want to, minimize the importance of development assistance. I think it's still important. But I think to contextualize what's available in terms of tools of influence for Australia, investment in the super sector has to be up there in the minds of policymakers. Now, the challenge, of course, is you can't direct these funds. You can't tell them where to invest. But I think you can certainly show them the opportunity, help open doors, and build their capability and their understanding. And there's plenty more things that government can do as well. The free trade agreements that have been put in place, the various multilateral agreements, that they're really important. They lay in important foundations for trade and investment. And I want to put a little shout out as well for the underappreciated area of sort of regulatory compliance and alignment, because that's really important in terms of allowing specific sectors to cooperate more directly with each other. So, the government does have a fair bit of work underway in this at the moment, and we're looking forward to seeing what they come out with later in the year.
Touching on that Japanese point, an interesting thing I've found, especially being in Jakarta at the moment, I actually play rugby here. And I didn't realise the number of Japanese expats currently living in Indonesia. So when you look at the team demographics, there's 5 teams in Jakarta and one's fully from Japan. So there's a huge amount of Japanese business already here existing in Indonesia when you put that in a bit of perspective.
Yeah.
Kind of how does DFAT work a bit differently to some of these Japanese and Korean companies? I know in one of your articles, business and government work a bit more hand in hand when they're looking at entering a specific company into a new market in Southeast Asia. Could you explain a bit more how that works?
Yeah, look, it's been quite a few years since I was in the Foreign Service, but what I'd say is that there are limitations around our diplomats, around our commercial diplomats as well, about how far they can go in terms of advocating for Australian business interests. As a general rule of thumb, Australian officials will advocate for a particular sector, but they'll be really cautious about picking particular companies within that sector to then advocate. And when it really gets to the pointy end of deal making, I think generally speaking, Australian officials are not in the room. I'm sure there might be exceptions to that I'm not aware of. But the interesting thing here is that those limitations don't apply as much to diplomats from North Asia and to our American friends. And it's particularly interesting because in Southeast Asia, they're very comfortable with really close relationships between business and government, and business and politics. It's something very deeply enmeshed in those countries. So in many ways, that's their preferred way of working. So I do wonder whether there are opportunities to evolve those rules. I think there needs to be appropriate guardrails put in place, and there are risks. We need to be clear that there are risks with, shifting the parameters here. But in terms of how we deal from a commercial perspective with the region, I think there's a case to look at those rules and maybe adjust them.
Yeah, I don't think it's as black and white saying, yes, this is the way forward. Obviously, you need to mitigate and you need to understand, yes, we might have some risks. So it's not as simple as just shifting the approach overnight. Our last questions here today is we have a lot of young Australians. The number of people learning Southeast Asian languages is not the highest at the moment. It's one of the historic lows. How should we encourage young people to get involved with the region, but also coming from that, what advice would you say for young professional Australians who are looking to enter the region? What are some of the avenues, or what tips would you give them?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one, Nick. I am concerned about the decline of Asian language learning in Australia. I don't profess to have the answers for what we need to do to increase that. I think it's really complex and it's been happening for a while. I'm fortunate that I was able to learn Indonesian, and I think it's great to learn an Asian language. But equally, I don't think it should ever be a barrier. And I think for some people, the prospect of maybe learning a foreign language is a bit daunting. And you can still build Asia literacy and your Asia capability without necessarily being fluent in an Asian language. So, spending time in the region, engaging culturally, doing business there, these are other great ways to, build familiarity with the region. And I think it's doubly important now because, 2 or 3 years of COVID has disrupted many of those people-to-people links. So for younger Australians in particular, who may have found themselves stuck in Australia for longer than they anticipated, I'd say now is the time to go and visit the region, spend some time, get familiar. And it's quite possible that, a particular country will capture your interest and maybe you'll find yourself spending more time there. Maybe you'll end up learning the language. But I think now's the time to really invest and have those experiences and take those chances.
I couldn't agree more with some of your sentiments there. I think, yes, learning a language is extremely important and it does open a different gateway. But to start and come to a country, you don't actually need to always have the language background. If you're ready to learn, be accepting of the culture, that's a really good way to start, and the language can follow on a bit later. So I really like that. It's a bit less daunting for people. It's a good opportunity just to get their toes wet and see if they actually like working in the region before committing to solely learning a particular language or a couple later on. So I think that brings us to the end of our conversation today, Rob. So thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It's been a fantastic discussion. I really enjoyed your insight.
Thanks. Great to be here. Thanks for having me, and really great work on this podcast, Nick.